I want a top-down review of every reason why we had a close call. Why didn't we know about it in advance? Why weren't we asking questions? What are we doing actively to avoid it next time? Mm-hmm. How are we communicating that back out? Mm-hmm. We work in a very dangerous industry still, and we cannot ever sleep on that. We don't just commit the planning fallacy once. We consistently commit the planning fallacy over and over and over again.
Like, it's freaking fascinating to me that like architects, like, all right, explain it how you explained it to me. I'm messing it up here, but
well,
like what?
I wish you told me. I would have brought the part in the legal contract where, you know, it spells this out. But in general, your insurance carrier will come to your office.
Yeah.
And they'll tell you, hey, based on your contract, according to the law, mm-hmm. and where we see litigation, this is the stuff we need y'all to be particularly aware not to do. Don't say it will be done this way. Don't get on somebody else's job site and direct their workers about safety. Mm-hmm. That's not your job.
Yeah.
Don't direct them about how they ought to be going about their job. You're taking on liability for the contractor.
Yeah.
Do not do that. Okay. And so it breeds a kind of, and I understand it. And I appreciate the law, and I want to be mindful of litigation. Mm-hmm. The risk is real. It's not to diminish any of that, but it just creates a very defensive and timid culture in terms of, hey, how does that really work? Or how could I do this better? Or you know, we call it over the fence. Yeah. How do you reach your hand across the fence or potentially jump over the fence in an appropriate way? How do you do that? How do you be collaborative? And it's really hard when as you come up, you're being indoctrinated not to assume liability, to walk away from it, to throw your hand and say, that's not my job. That's not my department. So that's where we are today.
Well, GCs get trained on the flip side to do the same. Is to walk away from liability.
Shed liability. Liability. That's exactly where we've kind of gotten to, is like in a construction culture.
But it can't help but create these little gray areas between scopes of work, between design and construction.
Yeah.
Like, well, I expected you to have this in your design. Well, I expected you to do this as a part of your means and methods. Mm-hmm. And you're both like, you know, looking at each other, pointing fingers.
Yeah. Right.
It's a big area where there are the leaks in effort and the leaks in data are most visible. Yeah. Because in that transition, that handoff from one party to another, that's where you're going to lose your data. That's when, you know, we talk about getting all the information to one side of the curve. Well, as you hand off between phases, you see like the quality of the information that's transferred from one project participant to the other, it degrades. Mm-hmm. And part of that degradation has to do with these kind of walls that liability and sort of accepted practice have set up for us. Mm-hmm. So I had some means and methods in mind when I was designing it. Wouldn't it be cool if we did it this way? I am not able to actually have a conversation with my counterpart about that, where A, they might correct me, I might learn better, or B, they could use some information that I couldn't convey clearly in the documents, right?
Yeah, that's just bonkers town to me. Like, I understand it from an insurance perspective. Like, I get that. I feel like I've heard insurance mentioned like 4 or 5 times over the past day. Like, it was the same thing with like shop classes. I heard that the other day. I was like, hey, we need to get shop class back in school. Somebody actually was like, hey, no, we tried it. We tried to put it back in, but it was an insurance risk. Nobody wants to insure kids around power tools. I'm like, oh, that's a issue.
Didn't think about that.
We didn't think about that. Yeah. So from an insurance perspective, that's just, it seems like it's kind of getting in the way of some things. I get it. I understand, but man, it drives me nuts sometimes.
Well, you know, one of the things I appreciated is how cultural it is. Yeah. So we are a very litigious society by other Western society standards, right? And we often resort to, you hear a lot about people getting sued in the construction industry, people not wanting to get sued in the construction industry, et cetera. So there's a lot of wariness around that. I'll say this, I was able, I had the privilege, I worked in Sweden. They have a very different approach to this type of risk in that environment. We did a major project for, it was a state project. So the standards were very high. It wasn't, nobody's like backing down on risk on a project like that. And I said, well, we had these timber panels at the exterior of the building. And we were having a meeting with the program manager, myself as the architect. There was the contractor superintendent and the local manager for that company. And the question was, well, what happens if we get a leak on these very expensive wood panels? They're structural, that are forming the outside of the building. And all of a sudden now we've got wet wood or moldy wood, or you can imagine, right? We're working in Sweden, for God's sakes.
Yeah,
it's raining all the time.
Yeah.
What do we do about it? Who gets sued? And the answer was, we're going to solve it together. And that's now, whether legally that mapped in the Swedish context, I'm not an expert on that. I have no idea.
Yeah.
But I could say from a cultural standpoint, the idea was, if this is a problem, it's a problem for all of us. We're all going to figure this out. And this was my second project I had done with that crew, with that company. And I had every confidence that it would be that way. They weren't just saying, that wasn't just lip service. It really was true. But that was a totally kind of a different cultural mindset. And in fact, in that context, I did a 2-part contract often with that company, and where I worked for the contractor. And they wanted me to work for them. Mm-hmm. They wanted my input. It wasn't that, they were grudgingly giving me this. So that really helped us with the liability, because now I was talking to the guy in charge of means and methods, and I could suggest stuff, but it was his responsibility. So there's ways around this, but they're often cultural, and we have a very ingrained kind of backing away from risk, let the other party do the risk, instead of actually addressing the risk and talking about it directly and collaborating on it. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'd argue that by backing away from risk, sometimes there's inherent risk in that. Mm-hmm. Because you're leaving issues uncovered. You're leaving things that can come up and bite you later. And then we'll just argue over whose fault it was.
Yeah.
And that's this, kind of the litigious nature of how we do business. Rather than, I'm going to go ahead and embrace some of that risk, but we're going to get some of the knowable unknown unearthed now.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And that was one of the things, after I kind of started my consultancy, I started wondering about, hey, where in our industry, in our economy, do we embrace that risk? Like, I know that we have sectors that do that deal with that high level of risk all the time. And is there anything to be learned from that? Because I felt like they could teach us something about dealing with risk directly, or one of the things I started wondering about was we do these plans, and it just felt like the smallest thing could just throw the whole thing off, like a house of cards. And I thought, am I just not planning enough? Because I plan a lot. Or is there something wrong with my planning? Or is it my attitude about risk, where I have to plan all the risk out of the process instead of building an organization that can handle the risk for breakfast? That this is just what they do every day. And we're all okay with that. We know it's going to be unexpected. And that's kind of what set me off on this little exploration, is who does this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about like building teams and stuff too, and like building organizations that are really robust. You recently read a book on that sort of topic too. And we talked about it the other day in our pre-call, Eddie, and you weren't really a part of it. I wanted to dive into that though, because I feel like it kind of can go hand in hand, like some of this risk. And there's also, I'm sure, there's a fear of failure in some capacities. Like, people don't want to fail. They want to take that risk on of being seen as a goat and not the good kind. So what was the book? What was that again? I forgot.
Yeah. So a little background on this. So I got out of kind of direct production. I was in a more production role, started thinking about opening a consultancy. I was just reflecting on my experience. We had really done stuff in sort of modular offsite prefab that a lot of people were talking about doing. We had actually gotten experience getting projects in the ground on schedule, et cetera. And I started wondering about, the things that were still hard and why were they so hard? And one of these things was this kind of sense of fear, the fear of failure, and also of things being really tightly coupled. So in regular construction, we've got the critical path. And then you have a lot of things on the critical path that just sort of happen. They don't impact the critical path, but they still need to happen, right? And lead times being what they are in conventional construction, you've got time to do those things, right? Well, what we were selling in that particular job I was working in was the compression of schedule first and foremost. It was speed to market. And as you wring out all the slop of the critical path, everything becomes on the critical path. Everything becomes tightly coupled because you've got no more tolerance built into the schedule for these sub-processes. So everything's got to click. So one little thing can throw off the whole works. It's similar in manufacturing supply chains. If you run out of screws, the whole line will stop. You cannot run out of screws. You cannot run out of the right kind of screws.
In other words, you're screwed.
There you go.
This is awful.
I'm so sorry.
I'm glad that you reached for it. That was right there.
It was right there.
It was right there.
Had to break the fourth wall for that one too. Look at the camera. Screwed. So I wanted to just kind of get to the bottom of that. Is why was it we were still really frustrated, even though we had an integrated system where I literally controlled everything from design to the field. I mean, there was really nowhere for me to go and say it was some other externality. We had it end to end, and we still had these problems. We had these unexpected problems. And so I started looking at a book called Managing the Unexpected by two researchers, Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe. And it was really a study of what they call high reliability organizations. So organizations that are in a very critical environment, think about your aircraft carriers, jumper teams, fighting forest wildfires. Okay. These are like the elite teams out there, very dangerous, very dynamic environments. Things like air traffic control, things like NASA, right? And these are organizations we have in the United States that do this kind of very high operational tempo, very safe, very reliable performance over time. What do they know that I don't know about that kind of work? In most cases like that, like they mess that up, people die.
Exactly. Right. It's very critical.
High stakes.
Yeah, high stakes.
Yeah. It's not necessarily the case with construction, but money being lost, or heck, even morale, or like people just having a bad go of it at the office one day. I mean, that's part of it as well. Yes.
And I think the money, I think you're spot on with that. I think the money is very important because in manufacturing, it's kind of going back to, we were integrating manufacturing construction. In manufacturing, plants are just money burning machines.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to guide this enterprise safely through the storm waters, right? And if you're not careful, you're going to burn through your cash before you even know it. And so that gives you the sense of criticality and responsibility. There are hundreds of jobs on the line if you make a bad decision, and there's no playbook. This is kind of a new field. We're doing all of this stuff for the first time, this integrating manufacturing methods into construction. So there's not a lot of examples or templates that we can use. We've got to think through the stuff ourselves. And I think in the industry writ large, we're being asked to do that a lot more these days. And so knowing that a bad move could cause you to burn thousands of dollars with no result, or a stoppage on the line could cause you to miss a schedule and essentially, flame through your client. That added that sense of criticality. And then the final thing is, look, danger is still part of our job. We work in a very dangerous industry still, and we cannot ever sleep on that. Whether you work inside of a plant under roof or you're working on a site, safety is still people still get hurt and get injured and worse in our industry. And that also adds to elevate, the criticality of these things. So all of those things, I realize we're not fire jumpers and we're not aircraft carriers, but we have often similar demands on our teams, and we can learn a little bit from those types of industries.
It reminds me of steel in so many ways, and obviously self-servingly so, because that's where we have a lot of experience, but it's a manufacturing-esque atmosphere. The line has to move. And so if something's messed up that stops the middle of the line, production crawls to a halt, and, people get really irritated.
The number of times I've had a call, and I know you have, the beam's on the line.
The beam's on the line.
Yeah.
And
yes.
And a fire, man.
You've stopped, you were the stoppage for that. Well, stoppage equals a lot of things. It's interesting too, that in that industry, that manufacturing process, I don't know, even the cash side of things is a little different for construction when it comes to adopting this manufacturing process. You think of a car, we kind of know how money flows in the auto industry, like how the purchase happens, where the money comes from, what borrowing has to happen, and when it might land, what the risk is. That can vary heavily from client to client based on how it was financed for that client and, how available the cash is. We've seen companies brought to their knees just by not being paid, right? Just the money's just not available.
Yeah.
Everybody's there. Everybody's doing their thing, but the money's not available. The cash flow down to the company. Probably the number one killer of construction companies is just cash flow.
Yeah.
So it's interesting risk, and there's definitely a case to be made that, no, we're not fire jumping here, but there's importance. And certainly, we take that and say, well, let's learn the lessons, right?
Yeah.
Let's plug them in.
So, all right. So what were some of the key lessons here? Cause you kind of dissected this for us, and you coming to the table saying, hey, this was pretty cool, and I think we can have a really relevant conversation for the construction community about this.
Yeah. And right? I also want to just give one more piece of context to this, which is about the planning fallacy. So a lot of people like me love to plan. We love to make very elaborate plans, have everything lined up and tight and beautiful, and all the documents are completed. And then I'm saying, now I have what I need to execute, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is where I think a little humility on our part is due, okay? Because planning, no matter how much I planned, my plans would get tighter and easier to disrupt, actually. The more I planned, the easier it was to disrupt them through some unexpected event. Some concrete bid in Florida comes in way high, and all of a sudden, we didn't have that accounted for in our planning, even though we'd done several of these. That throws everything off. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of excuses in a way that throw us off, right? So just in terms of the construction industry, the planning fallacy is something I think we all need to talk about. You've talked about it on your podcast.
Yep.
And what I would say, the definition of that is a tendency of people and organizations to underestimate how long a task will take. That's very simply put. This was actually coined by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1979. If you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow, that's actually Daniel Kahneman. So this is part of his work that he's done. And in a study of large-scale construction projects in the Nordic region, this is probably very typical. There's an economist called Bengt Flyberg in Sweden. He found 44.7% overages on average for rail projects, 33.8% construction cost overages for bridges and tunnels, and 20.4 overages for roads. So we don't just commit the planning fallacy once, we consistently commit the planning fallacy over and over and over again in a way that is very statistically significant and has been studied.
Yeah.
And so that's just an inherent tendency on our part as planners to underplan. And there's a way to do this, to solve for this, which is called reference class forecasting, where you've got to take a big basket of projects, look at what they were planned for, look at how they came in at, and adjust your plans for that bias. And that's hard to do because you need good data.
Yeah.
But in any event, the planning fallacy is real. And so planning doesn't get you out of this, is kind of the main point. And so the 5 things I think that these organizations are able to give us are sensitivity to operations, very operationally sensitive. They have a preoccupation with failure. They have a reluctance to simplify. They have a commitment to resilience. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. Mm-hmm. And my favorite one is they have a deference to expertise. We'll talk about also what that means, but that's probably one that's going to resonate for a lot of people.
You're smirking, so I give you floor, sir.
Well,
you got the smirk, so I know that you want to talk.
The smirk is here because this is a good counterpoint to a drum that we've beaten a lot.
Okay.
And that is, if I could just plan enough, then I could make it go well. Mm. And I would say on its surface, well, that's an overstatement. That's an oversimplification of the problem.
Yeah.
And we're about to get into that, but I like that this is a good counterpoint to put on there. A good, let's plan. Like, this isn't going to be an argumentation against planning.
No.
This is simply going to acknowledge the fact that there's a little more to it than that. Mm-hmm. And I like that. Like, let's treat these as real problems and actually address something that will help instead of just, railing about things that people will click on the internet. So that's why the smirk. But
have you heard of that Churchill quote? He says, plans are useless, but planning is essential.
Yeah,
that's one of my favorites.
I like that.
Yeah. And so you need to be, it's almost like fitness. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to stop, drop, and plan at a moment's notice and recognize that 10 seconds later, that plan may need to go out the window and you need a different plan. You just need to be able to do that constantly.
Yeah. Well, that's resilience, right? I feel like that's commitment to resilience. That's being able to, push and pull the organization, but it comes
snaps back.
It snaps back.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't there a Mike Tyson quote that goes with that too?
Mike Tyson?
Yeah. Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah. Yeah.
I said it.
I love that one too.
In the faith.
Yeah.
I hope Mike sees that.
I'm sorry.
He gives you a call, Tyler.
Please don't punch me. Please. I would not survive. I know this.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I love both of those. I think I'm going to have that on the Modley t-shirt, actually.
There you go. So we're talking about resilience. Like, let's give some context here. Like, what sorts of things are we talking about? Like, something on the line, it changes, and like we need to be resilient towards that sort of thing. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So on the resilience one, the question is, if you're in an environment where you're almost constantly in crisis, and those could very much be for factors outside of your control, how does an organization come back from crisis? How does it maintain its reserves so that it can handle crises? Are you running the organization at full tilt? Are you keeping 20% in reserve in terms of what your capacity is? And are your managers threatened by idle time? Okay. Instead of looking at that as retooling, for example, right? We see that a lot. How come, this unit's underutilized, man? We need to get these guys to work. What's going on? But there are important things from a resiliency standpoint where those downtimes should be structured in. How does your organization learn? What is its attitude towards failure? Okay. Is failure a bad word? Are we truly implementing a lessons learned process?
Yeah.
Are we able to kind of fold that back in and get better? those are the kinds of things I think from a resilience standpoint. You look at one of the things I like to think about is, have you guys ever seen Jocko Willink's TED Talk?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Love Jocko.
And that TED Talk, he was so emotional about a failure that he encountered. And, I remember hearing it for the first time and thinking, my gosh, what is this failure that this man is, he's so upset, so emotional. He's doing a whole TED Talk about it. It took so much effort. And, all the bad news we'd heard about the Iraq war, his unit made it out okay. In construction terms, he would have been a success, but for him, there were specific failures that were unacceptable. And he took it personally, emotionally. It was a very big deal. It led to top-down reviews for him and his unit, which he did, you obviously never want. And you have to show up to those. I mean, really show up. And so, and then he's able to take his unit, get back in the field, get after it again. That's a resilient organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking about Kyle Bucket the other day. Art of Manliness. He was talking about basically they would do drills over and over and over and over and over again. And in some of these drills, they would go in and they would quote unquote kill the leader. What happens? It's like, all right, they go in, they clear a whole facility. One of the trainers walks over and says, hey, team leader, you're dead. Like, you got to sit this one out. And so they got to go to the sideline and see what happens when that second in command comes up and starts leading the team. And that's training for resiliency. It's training for those incidental things of like, hey, what happens when for us, what happens when this person gets sick? What happens when this person goes and gets another job? And the idea of like, we're always running at 100%, we're not able to train for that because like we have no margin left to be able to do things like this. But and even when we do have the margin, a lot of times it's like you're licking your wounds from all the other crap that you just went through. And you just need to rest, So I love this idea of like running at 100% and like what that means to an organization, but also like the idea of resiliency and like how we can start training that into our people. So you were the one that found that though. Like you were initially the one that listened to that interview.
It was very interesting.
Put me onto it.
Hoping to get him on the show, but remind me, when I was young, it was like give 110%, like you're kind of taught that.
Yeah.
It was interesting when I got to college here, the coach was like, you need to play 90%. I'm like, what? Like, no, you need to, because in the message was you need to play under control. Like you need to play with a purpose. You need to play with your head screwed on straight. You need to I would rather you play at 90% than hair on fire, just running out of control. And a lot of times that's construction, right? Hair on fire, out of control, just trying to keep the thing from rolling off of the cliff.
Yeah.
So analogies ensue, I mean, in abundance. But
let's talk about marathons.
Let's talk about a lot of different things in life. Under control, having some reserve. I mean, these are good things that you don't think about them contributing to your resilience, but they are.
That's something
it's like having a savings account.
In manufacturing, that's something that's of the utmost importance, it feels like, right? Like having the reserve of like, hey, we have 20,000 more screws over here just ready to go. Just
you mean like buffer?
Yeah, you have a buffer. You build that in, and typical construction projects, like that's not the case. Like we're right there. We're right there at the line. I'm sure there's some cases in which that happened, but like it doesn't feel like it happens often. We're redlining.
We're redlining a lot recently too, because there's just so much, there seems to be this unending demand for construction services these days. Yeah. Right. And we're having to build out these mega projects right now. That's putting demand on the industry. And so one measure of success, hey, my guys, I'm running them full tilt day and night. Yeah. And look at all this money. Meanwhile, your quality is coming down. Your guys are getting burned out. Yeah. Your best guys are typically the ones that'll burn out first because those are your workhorses, right?
Yeah.
And what are you doing to extend the life of that operator, and also to provide the operator with the quality that he needs in order to continue operating at a high level? Because your quality of your operations will decline if you keep doing that. If you keep redlining everybody and just like pushing it through, there's no way to maintain focus. And you've got to have good decision making. You've got to have people that are rested. You've got to have, things like decision fatigue are real.
Oh God.
So how do you guard against that?
I felt that when I was managing the team of detailers, decision fatigue, because it's just like people are just pecking at you constantly, just asking questions, just like, what's this? What's that? What's this? And then you're done at the end of the day. I don't have anything else to give. And so, that's a real concern, I think, for a lot of leaders is decision fatigue.
Absolutely. We've even had things with just the tempo at which we ask questions. I was in a studio environment where, one of the biggest problems was everybody was constantly being interrupted. You get going, now your colleague has a question, they ask you, you answer them, and then you interrupt somebody else. And next thing you know, everybody's attention span is fried. They're exhausted from having to answer important and unimportant questions without being able to sort through that. Yeah. What is actually a priority? What is not? And so we would institute things like quiet time. Literally, if you're going to ask somebody a question, the time when we get busy talking to each other is going to be from these hours to this hour. One slot in the morning, one slot in the afternoon. The rest of the time, we're asking you to respect your colleague by letting them work uninterruptedly so they can get productive. That's a way of creating some capacity and resilience. Yeah. So we're just not fried every day, right? Yeah. It's little things like that. It's also bigger things like rotating teams in and out of some kind of training cycle, some kind of off-ramp. As you come off mission, are you sharing what you learned? Are you educating the others? Are you implementing improvements to your procedures so that whatever mistake happened, and it's okay to admit to, isn't happening over and over again? I know you guys were talking about standards that weren't getting picked up with one of your owners recently, right? Well, that's a cyclical activity, and that helps charge people's batteries actually, but you've got to be deliberate about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
You remember the red Solo cups?
I know of red Solo cups, yes.
No, like we had the same open offices really contribute to that kind of interruption and schedule.
Yeah, those red Solo cups.
Yeah, so we just got red Solo cups, and we would put them on a partition when you were underwater and doing a production activity, so everybody around you would respect the fact that it was your quiet time.
Right.
Mine was always there.
And that's
the danger of the flip side of that, because you don't have anxiety.
Yeah.
But now the people that really need to ask you something, they have the anxiety, and that's not fair either.
And then they would start to disrespect it, and then the cups
went over.
I like to break systems.
They're playing the cup game on.
I love putting systems in place, but I also like not abiding by them and breaking them.
Yeah, we all do. We all love that. Yeah,
it's a good time.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So you mentioned kind of the failure component of this too.
Yes.
Right. Like we've talked about that a little bit, but like, what are some of the ways that you're seeing like people debriefing like on a project? Like what are the recommended ways to debrief on a project and make sure that those failures don't happen again? We can learn from them.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll just start by telling this one story about mindset, about failure. And again, it ties a little bit back to that Jocko Willink thing, because close calls, the difference on how the close call is treated from a regular organization, maybe a construction organization, which is like, hey, we got away with it. Good job, guys. Don't let it happen again, but let's keep going. All right. That's, woo, I'm glad we dodged that bullet, right?
Yeah.
Versus what the hell just happened? What do you mean we just had a close call? I want a top-down review of every reason why we had a close call. Why didn't we know about it in advance? Why weren't we asking questions? What are we doing actively to avoid it next time? How are we communicating that back out? Okay. There's like a Churchill audit where he would ask these types of questions.
Yeah.
But like the The preoccupation with failure means that close calls are treated like failures. We don't do that in our field of work. Okay. And that's a culture shift I think that needs to happen. The other problem is, as you get successful, you become complacent and you're a victim of your own success. And we've seen this. This is what happened at Challenger. With Challenger, they were getting test failures in the O-rings well in advance of the explosion. Okay. But they would categorize that. That's an in-family failure. We don't need to worry about that. There's out of family failures. Those are big deals, but this is inside the family. We're okay. And so the initial O-ring failure would blow out a little bit and there'd be some blowback and they'd record it and say it's not a big deal. Then the next ring failed. And then after that, we had the catastrophic failure of the launch. Each time, that organization, which is really good, was normalizing what the acceptable limit of failure was outwards until it became catastrophic. And that's because they were so good and so safe all the time. And you just saw this happen yet again in Boeing, right? We followed the story with the Boeing, with the Dreamliner, all of the failures there, explaining it away. And then you have the autopilot, the system controlling the airplane, and that was failing again, and it led to some major crashes. So that was a company that was very successful, very good at this, and yet became complacent over time. And then finally, my favorite person, the poster boy, in my view, of preoccupation with failure is Nick Saban.
Okay.
I love Nick Saban's attitude about winning, because he'll be at the press conference. The team will have just dominated everything they did, and he is just pissed off because he saw something that they didn't do. That is how you guard against complacency. That's a very reliable organization.
It is.
Saban too, and you get him in the interview, they might try to fluff him up a little bit, and he's like, but he's going to come at you about the facts of the matter.
Exactly.
Right. So OSHA terms, this is a near miss. Like in safety terms, this is a near miss, correct? Yeah. So, we've got applications for organizational learning. We also have applications for construction safety, because this is totally a cultural thing on that side too. Regardless, and great example from the Challenger, regardless of whether we got away with it or not, we may not next time. So are we going to go back and address and correct the behavior? Or are we going to go along and say, well, it's a good thing nothing happened.
Just happens sometimes. Right. Yeah. That O-ring just fails occasionally. It's all right.
Man, I've been in the room on this one, and I'll tell you what happens. We'll have, I'm not going to mention where I was, but I was working somewhere, and we'll have a safety officer, someone in charge of safety. Okay. And we had an incident. All right. What was the incident? We're all in the boardroom together. Well, this and this happened. Okay, is that going to trigger an OSHA response? Look over to the safety guy. Safety guy says, I don't think this one will trigger an OSHA response. All right, and why is that? Okay, well, technically this and this happened and it didn't reach the threshold. Collective sigh. Phew, I'm glad we don't have to do that. All right, just make sure it doesn't happen again. Next.
Yeah.
And that to me is not at all what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that happens a lot. I think we all sort of do that because we're trying to get through the day. But really, we've got to take that kind of failure mode analysis much more seriously and rigorously if we're going to be more reliable. And near misses are, they're taxing to your system. Safeguards are not working that should work. There's some lesson in there that you're not internalizing that you should be internalizing. And doing that work relieves your teams downstream of that burden. And so you could be doing that, and instead you're choosing to willfully ignore it and just keep doing what you're doing. And to me, that's a problem.
That can come in other forms too. So, obviously the human safety element, but signing contracts, like going into contractual relationships with maybe uncertain terms or, the inception of the process happening in a certain way that is kind of wobbly, like it's going to put you at risk. Continuing to ignore the fact that you're aiding and abetting and enabling poor drawings to come down the line. I mean, we see there are certain designers that you're like, wow, they consistently put out work that causes us an issue when it gets downstream.
Yeah.
I need the work. I need the money, and we do it anyway and enable the process to happen again. So throwing the stop on that and being like, no, stop the madness. Let's look at this. Like we missed, it was a near miss last time, but it may not be this time. And if it's not a near miss, here's the damage. Here's the damage.
You have to have a receptive party. And I feel like a lot of times people aren't receptive to hearing like, hey, this didn't go that well. Like this process wasn't very good. In our instance, like with steel, we're talking to a structural engineer or an architect for that matter. And we try to give feedback based off of a previous encounter with them. Or heck, I mean, during that same job cycle, we have another detail that's similar and we try to give that feedback. We've encountered two types. One shuts it down and they're just like, just do your freaking job, shut up, just make it work. And then the other kind is like, oh yeah, let's talk, let's fix it. Like, let's be proactive and try to fix the issues.
A lot of this has to do with, leadership too. The leadership bought into all of this, right? And then as a leader, if you're in charge of an org, you can't always decide who to work with. I mean, sometimes you got to take that job and the architect or whoever's unresponsive. So be it. But over time, I mean, you demonstrate your commitment and how you steer your enterprise and what do you steer to and who do you try to do work with. And so over time, I think if you can maintain your values, these kinds of values, then you're going to find yourself in the right kind of company. And I think being able to state and restate and clarify and continuously say, hey, we want to do things differently. This is what we're about in this business. These are the kinds of partners that we think work well with this. And these are the benefits that we think this will engender, right? That's up to leadership. And if you're consistent over time, I think you will find both internally and externally partners that want to work along this line, And it may be that you're able to manage risk at a better level than others. And as a result, you have a higher return or value placed on your services, right? So it's a way of positioning yourself vis-a-vis the conventional. Perhaps everybody else is okay with that and you're just not, and you're going to get more quality work as a result. It's possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on, because deference to expertise was something that you kind of seem excited to talk about a little bit. So tee that up for us. What is deference to expertise?
Well, I think that's something that we can probably all relate to a little bit, which is sometimes someone in the field will really have the clearest idea of what to do and how to solve a particular problem. And it's often that's also probably recognized by their peers.
Right.
And so sometimes I think in construction, we run into, well, what's a chain of command? Or have you taken that up the flagpole? Okay, how do you get that back up? And that's where you can lose time. You get frustrated. Communication's really, really hard, or whatever. You can't convey what you're seeing back to HQ. The decision maker won't make a decision. They don't get the urgency. A number of things can happen. What more successful HROs are able to do is they basically can push the authority out into the field, into the most experienced and most directly engaged with the problem without breaking the chain of command. So the way that works is the formal authority goes from whoever's managing it out to the person with the most expertise. And it's there until the crisis or issue is resolved. And everybody understands how this works. This isn't like you're breaking stuff. And once that issue is resolved, the authority transfers back to the regular chain of command. And so operations that know how to do this can flexibly adapt to these situations without necessarily upsetting the apple cart every time. And I've seen in construction where that's been an issue, right? You'll have people fighting about what to do and who should make the call rather than actually solving the problem. So that's not an issue for, and look at the example of the fire jumper, right? There's no way that a person in HQ is going to be able to dynamically assess what that wildfire is doing. It's best left to the commander in the field, even if they're junior. They're the ones with the ability to see, and HQ gives them their full backing the whole time to back them up 100%. What do y'all think?
I mean, I feel like being kind of the history, like I love a good war flick. I love military history.
You're going Band of Brothers on this, aren't you?
Think of how many movies where you've got the guy in the field that's in the middle of the firefight and something's going down and you get the call from the guys, back off of the line and they're ordering you to do whatever. And there is an instance in Band of Brothers like this where it's, I want you to come back and report what's going on. And, it's usually, respectfully, sir, you can go and, go to heck. And then, hang on, I've got men to lead and they solve the issue directly in front of him because they can assess that issue.
Right.
And what happens is you've got respect for the person in the field that engaged the problem, has the wherewithal, knows what's going on around them, and that they're the one that needs to solve that problem. That person back at the tent is out of touch. They don't see what that guy sees. He needs to direct his men. And I do see this in construction. There are many times that we do get hung up in this linear chain of command. And I think we overcomplicate issues as a result of it. The solve could be easier than what we're making it by allowing it to be a little more dynamic. Bureaucracies, I don't think, function easily this way, but dynamic teams do.
No, they don't.
Bureaucracies seek that control, but I think dynamic teams allow for the independent brains of people that are on the ground to make decisions and calls where it needs to be made. And it doesn't break the leadership chain.
What does RFI do to this? That's kind of a loaded question. I feel like it just goes through so many flipping hands. Like RFI, and you pass them to people, they go up and down the chain of command, and they hit so many desks instead of just having that one little linear piece of communication and being like, hey man, I need you to solve it. Just fix it. Make it right. Like, I understand the documentation side of it. I get that. But like, I feel like RFI, dude, I freaking hate RFI anyway.
It's all good until somebody puts one anchor in the thing that needed 6, and right, so,
yeah.
I don't think we just completely push off proper construction documentation with this at all.
No.
I think this is just a call for being able to lead dynamically.
Yes. And I would say speed and schedule is kind of one of the anvils that can help drive this, because say you're trying to not lose your schedule gains. It's vitally important. So the answer is, in my view, have rapid response capability for that operator so that the RFI answer is a piece of support that we can give them in them doing their job. And so having all of that, and that goes back to the resilience piece. The resilience piece is where you start building in these speed gaining, but you want speed without losing any accuracy, right? You want to be able to perform high reps, but like perfectly. So build in those things in your downtime so that your operator and then designate certain procedures. Hey, if we get into this kind of situation, the way it's going to work is that field team lead, they're going to make the call. All right. And everybody, we're talking about this first as either a lessons learned or something that seems to happen a lot. Now, as an organization, we're learning from it. We're instituting some kind of procedure. Hey, we're going to push the authority down to the person in the field, and we're going to push to have a rapid response on the RFIs. We're going to push our clients or our customers to also understand when this type of thing happens, we need a response within 24 hours, whatever. Okay. And then empower that leader to use that mode, right, during the process.
Yeah.
Hey, we're back. It's whatever he says. We're backing him up 100%. So you need to talk to him, not to me.
Yeah.
Right. That type of stuff. And I think that's how you can start developing these like dynamic. I love the idea of dynamic teams. That's a really cool term. I think that's exactly what you're looking for.
That dynamic team, it pushes back at the thing I call bureaucracy out a lot. Like it's some like easy thing to define. I mean, bureaucracy takes a lot of forms and has a lot of functions. But what I mean by that as kind of a trope is when, one person in the organization knocks the coffee cup over and now nobody can have coffee in the company anymore for the rest of all eternity.
Right.
One teacher in the school brings a Tupperware in and leaves it in the classroom, and the classroom gets ants, and none of the teachers are ever allowed to have any snack food in their classroom ever again. It's we're going scorched earth instead of directing our attention at the one thing that needs to be address it and move on. That's not dynamic at all. That's just very blanket sweep, very static, we have rules. Don't violate the rules, even if you have reasons to violate the rules. And I mean, there's a lot of good decision making that has happened in the world in violation of rules.
Yes.
Where somebody kept a good head on their shoulders and said, not in this instance. I need to go around it. And I think you have to people well enough to allow them to have their brain, right? Every set of hands. Yeah. Every set of hands has a free brain.
Right.
Well, let them use it. Let them use their brains. And I mean, we do that. Yeah. Within, you're advocating for preparation. Like we're preparing for this.
Exactly. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. It's not going to happen. No, in fact, it is going to happen. Yes, exactly.
So now in preparedness, when you can do this, when you can break with the normal chain, break with the normal processes so that you can get something done.
Right.
Before the concrete dries. Like,
right.
I'm in the middle of a pour and something happened. The rebar cage broke right in the middle of the pour.
Right.
Are we going to stop, let it all dry, and then figure it out? No. We need something dynamic.
And that is so that's the you're talking about the difference, but also the expert. The expert's the only guy that has the mix of the experience, the knowledge, and the intuition needed to solve that situation. Micromanaging that expert doesn't improve the outcome. Empowering that expert and recognizing them for being an expert, that's what's really going to make the difference. And you need to be in the business of creating and nurturing expertise if you're in this line of work, in my opinion. So being able to defer to that expertise, trusting your experts in the field and letting them go, and then understanding that they're going to hand back the control at the appropriate time, that's key.
I like it.
This is good stuff, man.
I love it.
What was the name of this book again? What was it?
It's called Managing the Unexpected.
All right. We're going to link.
Could be named Managing Construction.
Managing Construction.
Well, it's always unexpected.
That's right.
All the time.
Yeah,
all the
it
time.
seems to not change.
We'll add that in the show notes because I think, and I'm going to pick that up too because I haven't read it yet. But I think obviously it's applicable to construction. Duh. We just talked about it for over an hour.
Yeah.
And I appreciate you bringing the book in and just being like, hey, I'm seeing some of this stuff. I think that hopefully it's going to help some other people think about things and the way that they structure their teams and the way that they operate within their teams. I think that's the biggest call to action, right? Is think through how your teams function, how things are, how dynamic is your team? Is there resilience built into it? How do you guys approach failure? Think through these things. You got to. It doesn't matter if you're actually leading a team or if you're, part of a team. I would suggest too, like, because eventually you might actually lead a team. Start thinking about these things, start viewing the leadership, start asking why, start asking questions. Like, let's make this industry better, I think is really the call to action here, right? Multiple calls to action. So many calls to action. Just go do good things, right?
Yeah, and I think it's really putting operations front and center in construction, back on the center. Is like, hey, this is really what we're thinking about. How do we start? How do we execute? How do we off-ramp? And we're doing that over and over. We're just getting better at it. So putting that block and tackling, the true operations front and center and focusing on that as an organization, I think that's the most fundamental thing. And then making those operations better for everybody, including, our customers and our people. That's really, I think the call is like, we've got to look at operations. It's really important.
Yeah. All right. Well, dude, thanks for coming and joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
Heck yeah.
I know, this is great.
It's
beautiful studio.
Yeah, we like it.
Nice.
It's been pretty good. All right, guys, we'll go build something awesome.